For many years now, I've been a keen user of the Filemaker data separation model, and yet when I attempt to find information about security of this model on the internet, all I find are criticisms of the model. So I want first of all to defend the model and then to explain what I have found out about data security. If we look at the single database model, and in this presentation I am assuming that you, the viewers, are very familiar with Filemaker, with creating layouts, scripts, controls, etc. And I just want to explain the general single database model first of all. When a person opens the database, the first thing they will see will be a screen with controls of some sort. It may be controls to put the data in alphabetical order or to print address labels or whatever. In the background to this will be data tables. For example, one table might be made up of members of a club, and another table might be made up of information about cities from where the members are from, so that in one table each city can be represented and a lot of information about that city, its population or whatever. Normally in using Filemaker we will use relational databases, and this requires some work on the relationships table in the database, and the relationships table will establish how the information is connected. For example, if a person is from Dublin, a member of the club is from Dublin, and the other table with cities, Dublin and all its population and details will be there, and it will be linked through the name Dublin or some code. As I say, I'm assuming that the users are familiar with all these levels of the creation of a single database. So what happens when we move to a data separation model? In the data separation model, the data is kept in a separate database, represented here by the blue rectangle on the right, the back-end data, and the data tables are there. However, the front end has the controls, for example, put in alphabetical order or print labels or whatever, and also has the relationships table. And in the relationships table, each table represented there is linked to a table in the back-end data, so that hopefully everyone who's watching this understands those particular processes and can create a data separation model. Now, what are the advantages and disadvantages? The disadvantages are fairly obvious. If you have two files instead of one on your computer, it's added complexity. It means you have to maintain two files. If you want to adjust the controls, you go into one. If you want to adjust the data, you go into the other. Field additions in particular, or field modifications, are awkward because you need to go into the data file to do that. There are definite disadvantages, but notice that I mention if these are both on the same computer. What happens, as in my case, I have a client down the country. That client wants to be able to use the data continuously, so if I want to make a modification, I don't want to interrupt that client's use of the database. So some of the advantages of the data separation model is that the front end can be updated independently. The user down the country can continue accessing the data right up to the moment that he or she receives the new front end, and it's only a question of a few seconds to transfer that updated front end into the Filemaker directory. This works best where data field changes are rare, and in the databases I've done, I spend a lot of time creating the fields, and therefore modifications to those are very rare. If there's a modification, it obviously means that the user needs to send me the data file, and I will make the amendments and send it back. And while that data file is being processed, the user is asked not to make any changes to the data. That's a drawback, but that would be a drawback also with a single file. So for me, the data separation model is an ideal one where I'm dealing with clients who are off base. So now, having given that backdrop to the difference between the data separation model, the single file model, the advantages and disadvantages of both, let's look at security. The big question is, does a username and password need to be registered in both the front and back end files? Now, to be honest, I've been doing that. So if Joe with the password XXX has access, I will put in Joe with XXX in the front end and Joe with XXX in the back end. That in fact is not necessary. I've only found that out recently, and I want to outline the security approach I have found that works. Hopefully I am an amateur, and I'm hoping that this makes sense to the professional database designers out there. First of all, in the front-end controls, you create your admin user and password. This is essential so that you can get in there and make changes to the layouts or to the data or whatever. Secondly, create a user, for example, called default user, but do not add a password. This is important. You do not add a password to this user. Then you create a privilege set for this default user, one that gives access to all the required layouts in the front end. Right? That is important. So the default user has the privilege set that gives access to all the required layouts. Meanwhile, on the back-end data, again, create an admin user and password. Might be the same as for the front end. That's up to yourself. An admin user and password for that. Again, so that you have access to the data, to all the tables there, and any controls you might have in the back end. You create any user pass and password account for those that will access the database. So if you have 3 clients who are going to access this database, this is where you set up their accounts, username and password. You also create a privilege set for these users, ones that gives them access to all the required data, which of course is in the back end. Now, the next thing that you need to do is in the front end, use file options to require login by the default user and a switch to a layout relying on the back-end data. In other words, when someone opens the front end, it will log in using the default user and will automatically switch to a particular layout, one that is calling up the back-end data. That is important. That is the setup, right? And what's important to remember here is that users only need to be set up in the back-end data file. They do not need to be set up in the front end. At the same time, remember that both front end and back end will require admin user and passwords for the ongoing development of the database. So what actually happens when the front end file is opened? And this is my understanding of it, and I hope I'm right. The front end file opens automatically, since the default user has no password. So it has a quick look, default user logging in, no password needed, right, no login required. Then it switches to a layout with data from the back end as set up in file options. Now it's running into a difficulty because the back end does have security. It does require a username and password. So the back end security kicks in and the program requests a username and password, Joe and XXX, for example. The request for these comes from the back end and not from the front end, right? The user supplies these and access is given to the secure back end data via the front end. And the database will work transparently for the end user, hopefully. Note that if you do want to gain access to the front end as administrator, before you open it, you need to hold down Opt when clicking Open this file, so that it will actually look for a password for that particular file. And you can set up then, you can feed in your admin password and your admin username and password. Hopefully that explains the security on data separation model, and I certainly, it has meant a lot for me because it means all I need to do is set up the user names and passwords on the data file. There are a lot more intricacies to this, of course, and the experienced FileMaker developer will understand these, will know how to do them. I think it's just this link between front-end security and back-end security that has tended to elude people. Thank you for your attention, and I do hope these remarks are useful to you. Thank you very much.